Right then, good afternoon, everybody. I've just started recording this session. So if you have any objections to that, please say so now, and we won't record. The intention is just to give people who aren't able to make it today a chance to watch Nick's presentation at their leisure later. But we often don't record and circulate these, so not a huge problem if there are any objections. If not, I'll proceed. We are joined today by my colleague for the duration of this meeting before I sign off for good, Nick O'Donovan from Manchester Metropolitan University. Nick is a member of the Future Economies Research Centre. I'm also delighted to say that Nick is joining the Political Studies Association's Political Economy Group, which is co-hosting this session today as deputy convener, and will be hosting this year's annual workshop for the group. So stay tuned for more information about that later in the year. Nick is going to be talking to us today about his research on knowledge-based growth regimes, and in particular, recently, I think this week, published his book on knowledge economy and the pursuit of the knowledge economy in the UK, which is going to be primarily focusing on in his presentation to us today. So, Nick, over to you whenever you're ready.
Thanks very much, Craig, for that introduction, and thanks for making this your swan song in your current role. And thank you to everyone for joining us, for taking the time out of your days to participate in this conversation. I'm really looking forward to getting your feedback. So, as Craig mentioned, I'd like to talk to you today about my new book, Pursuing the Knowledge Economy, A Sympathetic History of High Skill, High Wage Hubris. Now, the aims of this book are really threefold. First up, it's an intellectual history of the idea of the knowledge economy, looking at how this idea was first advanced in social scientific and management theory circles back in the late 60s and early 70s, how it influenced mainstream economics in the 1980s, and how it came to dominate public policy in developed democracies, at least, in the 1990s. Now, the book goes on to document how those ideas have proved remarkably resilient, so surviving the war on terror, surviving the global financial crisis, and even the COVID-19 pandemic. Those policies implied by this knowledge economy analysis, things like social investment in education, research and infrastructure, liberalized labor markets, fiscal prudence, international openness, those ideas continue to constitute mainstream ideas in today's economic policy debates. But the book is also a history of the actual knowledge economy, the lived experience, if you like, of the knowledge economy as it developed over the course of the 1990s and 2000s, examining how the realities of knowledge-driven growth often contradicted the techno-optimism that we find in those earlier accounts of the knowledge economy. The book looks at how the promise of a digital revolution in which knowledge, skills, and creativity would become increasingly productive and increasingly valuable and increasingly well paid relative to capital has given way to a modern economy in which capital has proved remarkably resilient, as if anything is resurgent. The book looks at how the competitive dynamism of high-tech startups has given way to an economic landscape dominated by large digital platforms. How it also looks at how the supposed competitive advantages of developed democracies in the knowledge economy era have been steadily eroded by emerging economies that have combined social investment strategies with more authoritarian forms of political rule and economic management. So that's the history side of the book. On the politics side, it looks at the electoral implications of those economic shortcomings, examining how groups that have particular reason to be disappointed with the realities of knowledge-driven growth have become increasingly hostile towards mainstream parties and mainstream political figures associated with that policy agenda. And finally, the book evaluates the prospects for rebooting that agenda, rebooting knowledge-driven growth in the post-pandemic era, examining whether there's still mileage in its policy prescriptions, or whether governments need to do something else, something more, if they are to redeem the earlier promises of inclusive prosperity associated with these ideas back in the 1990s. Now, if you're thinking, that's quite a lot of ground to cover over the course of my lunch break, that's probably fair. Rest assured that I'm not going to try and deliver on all those claims in the space of the next 30 minutes, apt though they might be for a book that's about hubris. I instead want to make the slightly more modest claim that the knowledge economy deserves our attention, whether as social scientists, policy practitioners, business people, or simply as concerned citizens interested in the trajectory of our societies over the last 30 years and into the future. But before I do that, I just want to spend a little bit of time explaining what I mean by the knowledge economy. So to its advocates, the rise of the knowledge economy implied a new economic growth paradigm in which increasingly people would shift away from performing physical labor, physical work, creating tangible goods, delivering physical services, and they would shift, labor markets would shift, economies would shift towards the production of intangible goods and services, towards knowledge work, towards the creation of new ideas, content, designs, and so forth. Things like computer software, maybe new music, the schematic for a new microchip design, and so forth. In this new era, even where work still involved tangible goods and services, those goods and services would embody ever more sophisticated knowledge, and that knowledge would constitute an ever more sophisticated, ever more significant part of the value of those goods and services. And those goods and services would require ever more sophisticated skills to be developed, produced, manufactured, executed, whether that's the production of a more advanced jet engine, for example, or the execution of a more advanced medical procedure. Now, these ideas, as I mentioned before, they had been around since the late 60s, early 70s, but it was really in the 1990s that they captured the imagination of the policy-making community, with the large-scale adoption of computers, both in homes and in workplaces, and also with the spread of internet access. Now, those developments were seen as having particular implications for public policy. In particular, they were seen as paving the way for a greater level of social investment, particularly in education, but also in things like research, things like infrastructure. Now, the idea was those investments in education, in infrastructure, would pay back massive dividends because of this boom in knowledge work, because of the increased rewards, the increased productivity of high-skilled labor in this era. But it wasn't just social investment, and the knowledge economy also touched other spheres of economic policy too. So macroeconomic policy, for example, the idea that we need to keep public borrowing low, to keep interest rates low, to encourage long-term investment, the long-term investments that are required for private sector innovation, which often has very long research and development time horizons. It implied international openness in order to share ideas, best practices, new products across borders, so that countries could position themselves at the technological frontier. Now, it's commonplace in many academic circles, as well as in many political circles too, particularly on the left, to downplay the significance and the novelty of this new paradigm, to argue that actually there's very little to separate the knowledge economy era from the neoliberalism that preceded it. In UK politics, this means arguing that Blair showed a great deal of continuity with Thatcher and with John Major. Back in the 90s, there was that pleasing phrase, Blaigerism, to describe the adoption of the conservative agenda by New Labour. And you can see why that could be argued to be the case. Many policies that we might see as quintessentially neoliberal found echoes in the knowledge-driven growth era. Many were directly cut and pasted across from one policy agenda to another. Those include the emphasis on private enterprise and entrepreneurialism, emphasis on liberalized labor markets, on low taxes, low spending, and low borrowing to help encourage inbound investment and encourage a higher level of domestic business investment as well. And finally, an embrace of globalization, which was presented variously as an inescapable fact and an exciting opportunity. But it's worth noting that the architects of the knowledge economy agenda firmly rejected the idea that they were simply Thatcherites in progressive clothing. Anthony Giddens' third way was explicitly defined in opposition to neoliberalism. So that was the second way against which he defined his third way. David Miliband, in a recent speech at an event to mark the 25th anniversary of the '97 election, argued that if it means anything, neoliberalism means a belief in untrammeled market forces and a minimal state. This is what its adherents believe, but this was neither the mindset nor the policy map in the mid-1990s. We promised to expand and modernize the role of the state, not reduce it. Gordon Brown, in his autobiography, described his time in office as an attempt to swim against the neoliberal tide. In fact, it's pretty much a surefire way to really annoy anyone associated with the New Labour years, is to describe that Blair government as neoliberal. Now, that's not necessarily a reason not to do so. It may well have a great deal of analytical value, and it can also be slightly amusing if you're the kind of person who gets their kicks from baiting centrist dad types. But it does at least suggest to us that there's something a bit more complex going on here. Perhaps we in the academic community, in the political economy community, perhaps we're using different definitions of neoliberalism to the one used by these advocates of knowledge-driven growth. Perhaps we're using similar definitions, but have slightly different interpretations of events. Perhaps we have the same definitions, but different interpretations of the motivations of key actors, or we place different levels of emphasis on whether good intentions actually matter that much. Now, the book attempts to reconstruct the perspective of these figures from the mid-90s, not just in the UK, but also in the US and to a degree in various European, continental European countries as well. And it attempts to lay out those views at some length. That's, if you like, the sympathetic part of this historical account. It's not time to go into a lot of the nuance of those accounts today, but I think what most supporters of a knowledge-driven growth agenda would say was the key differentiating factor, the key thing that separated their outlook, their policy proposals from neoliberalism. I think they would probably argue that the key thing that separated them from that agenda was their emphasis on social investment, public spending, particularly in education, which would both facilitate faster levels of growth, but also make that prosperity more inclusive, spreading opportunity to people who could not afford to make those investments in their own human capital, in their own skills and education, in their own right. And when combined with that social investment, the advocates of knowledge-driven growth would argue that many other aspects of their seemingly neoliberal policy agenda would become more progressive, more inclusive, particularly when they were also combined with changes in the economy outside the world of public policy, so independent of public policy, arising from changes in technology. And those changes included the dematerialization of production, the shift to, if you like, a weightless world of production, which would supposedly make capital less relevant to knowledge-intensive production, meaning that educational opportunities and educational investments alone, without the need to redistribute resources, without the need to share out cash better, and those educational investments would suffice for equality of opportunity and also greater equality between opportunities. That was how the argument went anyway. Now, in light of that, perhaps the clearest case for neoliberal continuity is that those levels of social investment fell short of being truly transformative. I think that's a criticism that some of the advocates of knowledge-driven growth back in the 1990s, I think that's a criticism many of them would acknowledge. Gordon Brown, I think, would probably take that view. Over in the US, Robert Reich, Clinton's first Labour secretary, has actually argued that in his accounts of his time in office. He'd claimed that global economic constraints, or particularly domestic political constraints, whether that's the media, the opposition within the executive, they'd argue that those constraints tied their hands, prevented them from pursuing the knowledge-driven growth agenda that they wanted to follow as wholeheartedly as they would have liked. Now, that also means that actually there are some countries, some examples of places you can point to where social investment was done better. In particular, Nordic countries, places like Sweden, Norway, Finland, they had much higher levels of educational investment as a proportion of GDP in this time period. And it's possible to argue, and looking at the evidence, there's a strong case for this, that they enjoyed more inclusive, more rapid, more robust levels of economic growth during this period. So there is a case to say that actually the problem here was more that the knowledge-driven growth agenda wasn't executed successfully. So the intention was good, the execution was lacking, and there are places where the execution was better that seem to have enjoyed better outcomes. I think there are more profound ways in which the era of knowledge-driven growth can be viewed as a continuation of the neoliberal era. And I think this is the kind of critique that's commonplace in a lot of the political economy literature, the work of the likes of Colin Hay, Colin Crouch, Stockhammer. They argue that the fundamental growth model of countries like the UK actually didn't change that much with the transition to the knowledge economy. Various iterations of these ideas, pointing out the ongoing reliance, particularly in the UK, to a lesser extent the US, on financial services, concomitant deprioritization of manufacturing, reliance on rising house prices and asset-based welfare to sustain demand, and this idea of privatized Keynesianism, the idea that household debt, higher levels of household debt, were being used to backstop demand, which obviously unraveled dramatically with the onset of the global financial crisis. Now, I don't actually want to deny any of those critiques. In fact, I think they're pretty helpful for explaining why the knowledge-driven growth agenda failed to live up to its expectations. And I draw quite extensively on them in the book itself. But what I do want to do, just in the remainder of this talk, and what I hopefully try and succeed to some extent in doing in the book itself, is to argue that it is important nonetheless to recognize the distinctiveness of the knowledge economy and of the policy agenda that was constructed around it. Most obviously, recognizing the distinctiveness of knowledge-driven growth produces an analysis that's at least sensitive to the self-understandings of some of the key political players of this era, which is a vital starting point for any constructivist account of events, any account that places ideas front and center. Now, admittedly, other accounts are possible. You might say that actors are deluded or they're just pawns in a bigger game of structural forces, but nevertheless, politicians and their advisors believe this stuff is important. They devote a lot of time and energy to rhetoric, to narrative making, and voters seem to view this stuff as important too. This stuff is important for political legitimation and for electoral success. And voters can sniff out politicians that lack a narrative, that don't seem to have a clear sense of purpose. Secondly, viewing the knowledge economy era as distinctive, I think, helps us to explain the timing of the political crisis or crises of neoliberalism. And what this book is partly responding to is the commentary on the rise of populism in a lot of recent academic literature, also in a lot of the mainstream media, arguing that populism is a product of left behind communities, growing inequality between the richest and the rest, growing inequality between regions, growing divides between capital and labor. And this literature uses those economic developments to explain contemporary political turmoil. But the fact is, most of those trends were already visible back in the 1990s. And I don't just mean visible in the data, but also taken up actively by political actors and political commentators. So why did neoliberalism not blow up then? Why is the so-called crisis of neoliberalism happening today rather than back in the 1990s? And one answer, and it's not the whole answer, but one important aspect of that answer, I would argue, is that the knowledge economy agenda was meant to be a solution to precisely those problems of unequal, unbalanced growth across regions and across the income distribution. Universal high quality education was meant to empower labor relative to capital under the conditions of the emerging knowledge economy. Then it would spread social inclusion, it would reduce inequalities between haves and have-nots. Educational investment would attract businesses to left behind areas because they could tap into the skills available there. And even if it didn't attract businesses to those areas, workers based in those areas could hook on to the knowledge economy, through remote working, through virtual offices, they could actually work for businesses located anywhere in the world, from anywhere in the world. So the knowledge economy agenda attempted to address that, if you like, initial crisis of neoliberalism emerging from the 1990s. And maybe it did an all right job of doing that. Maybe it at least convinced people that it was doing an all right job of doing that at the same time as household debt was expanding. Both possibilities I consider in the book. And that point relates to the next point on this list, regarding the distinctiveness of the electoral coalition that coalesced around the knowledge-driven growth agenda. Whereas in the 1980s, neoliberalism was more or less broadly rejected by voters in regions experiencing industrial decline and by younger voters. In the 1990s, the knowledge-driven growth paradigm drew support from both of those groups, uniting young city dwellers with the less educated and with residents of what I believe we're now contractually obliged to refer to as left behind places. Social investment was meant to attract those high skill, high wage jobs to those regions. And I also think that understanding the distinctiveness of that electoral coalition is also important today for understanding the unraveling of that coalition. It helps us to explain the subsequent collapse of social democratic parties in particular, which were very closely associated with this agenda. And it casts contemporary political volatility as a product of the decline of the centre, rather than the attractiveness of any particular alternative. I think a lot of accounts of the rise of populism founder on the easy availability of counterexamples. So you could say this is a revolt against globalization, but then or a revolt against neoliberalism, and then you can find rising support for political parties that advocate quite neoliberal policies on things like welfare, on things like taxation, and so forth. I think there's also, to a certain degree, novel policies that we're more likely to pick up if we distinguish these eras of public policy making a bit more clearly. Novel policies, particularly novel policy justifications. I think that the case that there's a lot of policy continuity is very strong, but the anticipated outcomes of that policy continuity are very different. Furthermore, distinguishing the knowledge economy era from the neoliberal era should give us a sense of what I've rather highfalutinly here described as epochal modesty. What I mean by that is that if this is just something that's unraveled over the last 25, 30 years, then perhaps it's not as cataclysmic or world-shattering as we might otherwise think. Perhaps we're not talking in contemporary political terms about the end of capitalism or the end of liberal democracy, but more about the unraveling of a particular electoral coalition and a period of searching for a new coalition and new ideas around which that coalition might coalesce. An interregnum, if you like. And that also implies that paradigm shifts are perhaps a bit more normal than we're used to thinking. If this contemporary moment marks the end of our third post-war paradigm after social democracy in Bretton Woods, after neoliberalism, we have the knowledge-driven growth era. If that's the case, then actually maybe paradigm shifts are a little more normal. Maybe we should relax a bit more. Another one will be along in a minute. Maybe like buses, two will come along at once. Finally, and I think probably most importantly of all, at least from the perspective of practical policy advice, distinguishing between the neoliberal agenda and the knowledge-driven growth agenda highlights that policies such as educational investment, supply-side levelling up have already been tried and they've already been found wanting. Which is really important because right now in this post-pandemic moment in the UK, we have people like Rishi Sunak arguing for a high-skill, high-wage economy driven by educational investments. Internationally, we see, pardon me, we see the OECD making similar arguments for greater levels of investment in education, in skills to prepare us for future recovery. And I think recognizing the knowledge economy agenda has been tried and found wanting helps us to see that actually these policies are almost inevitably bound to fall short of any hope of genuinely widespread, inclusive prosperity. To date, there has simply not been enough demand for high-skilled workers to replace all the mid-skilled jobs lost to technological change. In today's digital economy, capital plays a very important role. It's not been diminished, but actually the major digital platforms require vast quantities of platform in order to achieve critical mass, to attain the network effects that they then reap the economic rent from. So social investment and supply side reform alone is unlikely to cut through in an environment of platform capitalism. And also, contrary to expectations, developed democracies have not monopolized the upper echelons of the knowledge economy, but instead we are competing with the likes of China and India. Now, this is not to say that the policies from the era of knowledge-driven growth can't form part of the solution. It's only to argue that they're unlikely to constitute the whole of the solution. So that pretty much brings me to the end of my talk today. So I'll just finish with some self-promotion. So hopefully that's whetted your appetite for the book, or it's made you so angry at these ideas that you want to buy a copy so you can vehemently denounce it yourself. If you want to do so, it's available for less than £20 from all good bookshops and also from Amazon. And you can also buy it direct from the publisher, and there's a discount code for you there should you wish to do that. You get about 25% off the cover price, or about 10% off and free postage and packaging, depending on your perspective. So thank you all for listening, and look forward to hearing your questions.
Thanks so much, Nick. Really fascinating talk. I read the book in an earlier draft, and I think you've amplified some of the most important insights that you brought in those early drafts. I'm looking forward to reading the finished product. It's a great presentation today too. We're now moved to Q&A, as is the convention. I'm sure Nick's happy to answer any questions you might have about the talk today, about the wider project. Make yourselves known however you feel most comfortable. Put a question in the chat if you like. give out a little squeal if you want to unmute, just wave your hand, or use the raise hand function, and I'll find you one way or another. I see a hand up. I see a hand up from Matthew Watson immediately. So if Nick's ready, I'll let Matt take it away.
Thanks, Craig, and thanks, Nick. I've also read an earlier draft of the book, and it's a wonderful book. So I do recommend it very much to everyone. Nick, my question is about what underpins the historical story that you're telling, if I can say it rather too grandly. Could I tease you out on your historiographical approach? Are you approaching this question from a perspective that sees it as a particularly UK-focused problem, where the institutions of the UK economy, the traditions of the UK economy, its structure, simply didn't permit the degree of embeddedness that was required for the knowledge economy to work, or is it not that institutionalist account that you're really trying to bring into view, and is it a more general critique of these ideas? So is hubris, in other words, a distinct phenomenon of the British economy in this regard, or does hubris have more universal aspects to it? Thanks very much.
Thanks, Matthew. Shall I answer that one first?
Nobody's volunteered yet, so if you want to.
No, thanks, Matthew. That's a great question. Just in terms of my own background, so my doctorate was actually in history of political thought, intellectual history. So I have a tendency to focus on who said what to whom on what date, those kind of quite nitty-gritty questions of influence, which are quite fascinating in the case of the knowledge economy, because you can make random connections between people like Alvin Toffler, the famous futurist in the US, and Ayn Rand. He actually interviewed Ayn Rand. You can make connections between most of the leading figures in the economic debates of the 1980s in US academic economics. You find actually many of those figures popping up in the Clinton era as part of, say, the Microsoft versus Netscape trial. So there's very much an interest in those particular debates and the particular people involved in those debates. In terms of the broader question about is this a UK-based problem, or is hubris more universal? I think these debates did catch on in the UK, perhaps to a slightly greater extent than in any other country, even in the US, where the continuation of the pro-market dialogue was sustained by a bigger community of right-wing think tanks, and obviously you had Clinton losing control over Congress in the mid-90s, which made that anti-state, anti-social investment argument a bit more pertinent there as well. Nevertheless, what I try and set out in the book is actually a lot of these ideas have been tried pretty much everywhere in the developed democratic world. What I don't say in the book is actually these ideas are very popular in the international development community as well. There's a lot of interest in this kind of knowledge-driven growth across the world. And what the book is arguing is actually there are problems inherent in those ideas. It's arguing that actually the demand for high-skilled labor is unlikely to ever emerge to the scale necessary to deliver the inclusive prosperity that's being promised. And that's not just my argument, that's actually drawing on quite a lot of analysis by people like Autor, Goldin, Katz, people who came up with the race between education and technology kind of hypothesis, and now saying actually demand for high-skilled jobs doesn't seem to explain all or even the majority of what's going on in the US labour market, not since around 2000. So there's a definite shift in the knowledge economy as you see the rise of these big platforms. You see this dependence on data, on network effects, which require a lot of capital to create, to build up that community of users and that trove of data. So actually there has been a shift in the knowledge economy from how it looked in the 1990s to how it is now, and that means that those 1990s claims are hubristic in the US, in the UK, even in Norway and Sweden and places like that.
Thanks, Nick. Let's take a couple of questions. Oh, there's one from Arthur in the chat box. Hope he won't mind me reading it out. What has the implication been for jobs that are not completed from a PC? There's a vast amount of jobs in sectors like social care that don't get the same attention. And then while you're pondering that, Scott, James, you want to come in and ask a question?
Yeah, thanks, Craig. And thanks, Nick. I'm looking forward to reading the book. It's got me thinking about lots of things. I kind of wanted to push you a bit more, having not read the book, and maybe unpacking some of the political economy of the knowledge economy, where it kind of comes from, particularly in a British context, but specifically the relationship with financial services and the expansion of financial services from the 80s, because it strikes me that they're a key beneficiary in terms of economic sectors. You think about the high skills that particularly the higher education sectors generating in Southeast England, where's, which sector is the beneficiary of those high skills and those university degrees? It's financial services. So to what extent are those sorts of policies, that sort of knowledge economy agenda, how is that feeding into the expansion of financial services and also driving financial innovation in the 90s and 2000s, and then leading to the crisis that we know about post 2008? But which kind of comes first, in a sense? Is it the knowledge economy driving the financial services, expansion of financial services and innovation? Or is it the financial sector lobbying for those sorts of educational policies and those sorts of policies around higher education? So that's the sort of political economy aspect. It also got me thinking about Jack Copley's book on governing financialization. And again, this narrative that the British governing elites kind of stumble across financial deregulation almost by accident in the 70s and 80s. It's a way of solving these bigger macroeconomic structural dilemmas, and they kind of end up deregulating the city, and then they suddenly realize it's this great cash cow, so they just kind of run with it. So is there a similar story with the knowledge economy? I mean, do British elites kind of stumble across these ideas by accident, where they kind of come from, wherever they come from, the United States, whatever? Or is it more of a deliberate, concerted, strategic, almost, a sort of industrial policy aimed at sort of building up financial services and the service sector more generally? Thanks.
Great, and thanks, Arthur, and thanks, Scott. I'll probably start with Scott's question, as it's not written down, while it's in my short-term memory, it's easier for me to answer. Yeah, it's a really good point with regard to the role of financial services in this entire story, particularly in the UK. So other countries didn't place as much emphasis as we did in the UK on financial services, particularly financial services as a form of knowledge-driven growth. And it's really interesting, actually, looking at the literature. You can see financial services were in many ways viewed as the quintessential, probably alongside computer software, the quintessential knowledge-driven industry, because actually it's entirely weightless work. It's just moving digits around on the computer screen, and at least back in the 90s and noughties, didn't seem to require that much capital. Obviously, would have been slightly better come 2007, 2008 if they'd had a tad more capital, but it was viewed as this kind of paradigmatic weightless institution. I do get the sense, actually, that's more of a British phenomenon. So you see in the literature coming out of various UK government departments more emphasis on financial services as a source of demand for these higher skills than you do in US literature from this period. So I think I'm trying to tell more of the universal story, but I think actually that might be a very good explanation of why these ideas were particularly attractive in the UK context, the political economy of the finance sector. That's not in the book. But that's quite a nice. I quite like that as an explanation of that. The intensity of interest in this particular line of thought in the UK. Cool. And then Arthur's question about the implication for jobs that are not completed from a PC. Absolutely. One of the big implications of this was that those jobs were downplayed, deprioritized, and they were almost made to fit the knowledge economy template. There was the idea that we would be able to upskill a lot of social care workers and they would automatically become more productive somehow. That was never really particularly thought through, and they would sort of move up the income distribution as they became more productive. Whereas actually what tended to happen is the new, if you like, managerial technologies, managerial techniques have instead tended to remove those rungs that social care workers, nurses, etc., would historically have moved up into, the more sort of managerial roles. Those were either platformatized, outsourced, or just consolidated, so required fewer people in those roles. So a big part of this story, and I think a vital part of any response to where we are now economically and how we move on from this agenda, has to be a bigger focus on the foundational economy and those lower paid roles. So great question, thank you. And thank you, Scott, as well.
Thanks, Nick. I had a question myself, if you don't mind. It's the, I guess it does relate again to your sort of where you stand on the sort of big questions of political economy, like what's driving policy. But my question, I started my question with something more basic, which was, why is it that we're continuing to sort of focus on education spending as a way to achieve this sort of high wage, high growth economy? As you mentioned, you see this echoing all the time, including sort of Rishi Sunak's latest statements, and on the progressive side of politics as well, it's often a sort of default policy sort of agenda. Various explanations around, it's sort of the fit with neoliberalism, which I know you've questioned, and just sort of puts the sort of emphasis on individuals to sort of get themselves ready for work. It's an easier policy than trying to sort of reform the structures of the economy. Is it the fact that the evidence that's shown that this isn't necessarily the most effective way to achieve high wage, high skilled economy? Has it just been misread? Is there a sort of lag in how the evidence feeds through into policy, which is probably a story about sort of how paradigms sort of change sort of slowly and incrementally? So why is it that we're still seeing that sort of agenda recur time and time again, even if it isn't necessarily a successful one?
Yeah, very good question, and a difficult one to answer, because there are quite a few different explanations of that you can advance. They're all complementary and very hard to test. And I think my inclination in those circumstances is to say, well, can't really test all of these. So here you go. Here are all of them. I mean, I think there's a sort of political story around this. It's just quite a nice sell. It's a free lunch. If you can increase productivity, then people get more stuff and people are happier. And this is this feels like a way of selling something that grows the pie rather than divides it differently. So I think it's politically easier than a redistributional story. But I do think that is changing, and I think as the growth stagnates, what we've seen over the last 10 years, last 15 years now, is that the reality is quite clearly not living up to those promises. So there's an electoral story there about exactly how long you can go on explaining those things, and I think probably the mechanism of change is a sort of steady decline, erosion of plausibility in those claims. That is becoming increasingly more evident, and also quite a lot of interesting things in electoral politics around electoral entrepreneurialism and people creating constituencies and creating outlets for these different voices as well, for this discontent to be expressed. So sort of part ideational, part reality, which I guess is where a lot of accounts of paradigm shifts end up saying that there's an intellectual history story and a real world story going on here. So this is probably quite well aligned with that framework.
Okay, thanks, Nick. I know that Matthew wanted to come in for a second question, and then so I'll let Matt go first, and then Sean McDaniel has his hand up too.
Thank you, and sorry for butting in, Sean, and sorry for coming back again, Nick, but it actually follows on from the conversation that you're having with Craig. I think it's really interesting, this idea that somehow this is where you go to if you're looking for an easy policy, that there are all sorts of things that you could say that you wanted to do in relation to the economy. And if you wanted to say something that is unlikely to ruffle any feathers at all, that's unlikely to have any sort of discontent uttered in response, it would look something like this, wouldn't it? The whole idea of the knowledge economy seems to be based on a series of principles that it would be very difficult to find anyone who would disagree with at that level. So I wonder whether you could say a bit more in that regard in relation to how debates about the knowledge economy also fitted in with debates about macroeconomic policy. So is this where you go to if you sense that there's almost no space for you to talk about a macroeconomic policy that would change the structures of the economy, that would introduce a new fact of redistribution? Or is it how you deflect from those bigger arguments, those more difficult arguments, those arguments where you're not sure that you're going to have traction and that you're going to have to work politically harder in order to secure that traction? Is this therefore just almost a distraction from those bigger questions? So which way round does it work then? Because it feels as though you're telling both a story of potential paradigm shift on the one hand, but also a story of normal science on the other hand. If macroeconomics enters a period of normal science, is this all you can do? Or do you, or are the governments you studied acting as if this is normal science because this is the most that they want to do? Because that's two subtly different readings, isn't it, of the same phenomenon? Thank you.
Let's take Sean's question before we go back to Nick. Sean?
Thanks, and thanks, Nick, for the presentation. I have read a sort of a kind of earlier pre-publication draft, although I guess it was quite close to the final submission. So I just wanted to pick you up maybe on one of the comments that I sort of made on that draft that I read, and relating to your sort of final chapter. And I wondered if you could say a bit more about the discussion you have in that chapter around sort of the capacity to sort of reboot a kind of knowledge-driven growth strategy, and in particular, what that could look like for social democratic or left-wing parties today in the context of both the pandemic, but the need to decarbonize economies and so on. What lessons do you think the left would need to take from their prior attempts to capitalize upon this idea of pursuing knowledge-driven growth? And in particular, as you are relatively sort of sympathetic to some of those kind of attempts to push back on the idea that this was always a kind of neoliberal policy kind of program, and that there were naive, sort of hubristic attempts to pursue a kind of more socially inclusive form of growth, even though that didn't happen. But to what extent is the left's failure on that really a reflection of their sort of naivety, I guess, to accept the kind of the sort of strength of capital, and to accept essentially, or to believe that somehow in the context of weakened trade unions and weakened labour power, that somehow this model was going to actually kind of benefit working people? Is that not the core of the kind of failure here, that actually, you know, essentially it's the story of left-wing parties believing in the power of capitalism to provide for working people? Is that not kind of central to the failure, and would not a future kind of left knowledge-driven growth strategy need to rectify that, you know, a sense of needing to rebalance those sort of social forces?
Nick, do you want to take those two?
Yeah. Just 1 second. Cool. Yes. So yeah, great questions, and difficult, which is hence the hesitation and the frantic scribbling. So Matthew, to take yours first, I think it's hard to disagree with the analysis that you know, if you're looking for an easy policy that doesn't ruffle any feathers, this is exactly what you would do. I mean, I think people in the mid-90s would say that actually there were a few feathers being rustled around things like education, essentially state provision for education, for research, for infrastructure. They would say actually that is quite radical relative to the way in which certain parts of the new right were pushing towards a marketize everything, privatize everything kind of agenda. They would say, you know, at the very least we stop that. So, you know, maybe not things can get better, but things can get slightly less worse than they would have otherwise got, that kind of thing. Now, what's driving that is that because they see themselves as, I guess the question is that because they see themselves as constrained, they want to do something different, but they feel they can't, or is that just because they don't have the imagination, the policy imagination, to see that they can do things differently? And I think here I'd go back to the evidence, or rather the lack of evidence, for them thinking that they wanted to do something different anyway, but couldn't and were constrained. Because actually, I do think the ideological line is remarkably consistent. You know, not just in front of house with sort of public-facing publications, but also in a lot of the internal dialogue, the autobiographical accounts, and so on and so forth. I think politicians of this era really did believe this kind of stuff, and you know, politicians have continued to believe this kind of stuff, and you know, I did a stint working in politics, writing policy papers myself, and I've written things about you know, trying to engage in a race to the top through social investment rather than a race to the bottom through cutting taxes and shrinking the state. So you know, that was in sort of 2014, 2015-ish. So I'm guilty of this too, but it also felt like the only option. And I'm not sure I felt massively cognizant of other options, and I don't think other people around me felt massively cognizant of other options. I think there's an extent to which we shouldn't perhaps expect too much intellectual leadership from politicians, and actually the change of ideas has to come from outside to a large degree, and a lot of studies of paradigm shifts do point to that. So I do think more optimistically we might be starting to see that wider discussion now in the economics community. Is certainly a lot more diverse. Even orthodox economics is a lot more diverse now than it was sort of 10 years ago. So so yes, I think they probably are doing normal science, or have been for much of this story, but maybe things are changing now. Maybe I mean, one of the implications of this ideas versus reality structure is they can be out of sync, and it feels like maybe the ideas are starting to catch up in the economics profession. Sean, in terms of your question on the capacity to reboot knowledge-driven growth strategies, yeah, I think there are possibilities there. I think actually there are ways in which things have shifted for the better from the perspective of a left-wing reboot of knowledge-driven growth. Two in particular I'd highlight. One is we have finally actually done a lot more remote working. That remote work revolution has finally happened. There's a lot of pushback against it for various interesting reasons related to commercial interests in city centres, it often seems, but more than productivity. But that has happened, and I think the legacy of the pandemic is going to be at the very least a stretching of geographies, which means that actually you will see some of that income and therefore some of that demand that has been so concentrated in big urban areas finally starting to spread a bit further out. I'm not sure that's sufficient for vast societal change, but every little bit helps. I think the other thing that's quite favourable at the minute is actually a shift in the political economy around taxation. Firstly, there's more international coordination around corporate taxation in general than there has been in a long time. That's yet to fully bear fruit, but it looks certainly more promising than it has done at any other point in my life. But more than that, actually, even unilaterally, I think there's a growing sense that actually these kind of knowledge-intensive activities, back in the 1990s, they were seen as very footloose and fancy-free, whereas now we tend to see most sort of studies of these clusters of knowledge-intensive work point out they are incredibly regionally rooted. And, you know, some people back in the 1990s were pointing that out already. Robert Reich, Diane Coyle, actually were on the money on this, but you had other people proclaiming that the world was flat and therefore you know, jobs could just up and go anywhere, and that's not the case. And actually, if anything, more not the case for knowledge intensive industries, because to relocate those, you actually need to relocate the people with the tacit knowledge and the networks of knowledge that you find clustered in local areas, and actually they're harder to relocate than simply reconstructing a factory in a different place that's lower skilled. So actually that shift is positive from the perspective of a kind of new left agenda for knowledge economy. Is the problem left-wing politics believing in the power of capitalism to provide? I think for me personally, reading this stuff over the last few years and reading things that people sort of carry on saying today, I wonder if the bigger problem, if the bigger problem is actually a smaller problem, insofar as I think the left is far too willing to acquiesce to the idea that wages are determined by the marginal productivity of labour rather than various sort of socio-cultural and bargaining conditions, particularly under conditions where the economy is not working as competitively as it perhaps should, where capital acts as a constraint on access to capital acts as a constraint on enterprise. So I think actually shifting out of that mindset might be an easier move than we need something other than capitalism to provide, and actually just putting back some of that mid-20th century economics and political economy around wage bargaining, rather than just viewing wages as the outcome of some beautiful market process. I think that might be where a shift could be made more easily.
Thanks, Nick. We are running slightly over, but I think we've got time for one more question. Scott James has been waiting patiently. Scott.
Thanks, Craig. I'm not sure it's a very quick question. It's just really following on from what we were discussing before, and I was thinking about how the knowledge economy plays out in different national contexts. So to what extent is this an Anglo-liberal phenomena? So think about how the knowledge economy plays out in different growth models, export-led economies like Germany. I mean, in one sense, German export-led economies have always been knowledge economies. They've always been very good at generating these very high-tech specialist skills and then channeling them rather into a specific sector, the SME sector. So how does the knowledge economy kind of play out in that context? Whether it's kind of complementary or challenges that sort of traditional growth model. And my second sort of more general point, which you don't necessarily need to respond to, is I was thinking about how the knowledge economy, the other side of the knowledge economy, if you like, is the data economy and platform capitalism and the attention economy. Because what highly skilled workers who are not only generating lots of knowledge, but are also consuming lots of knowledge on digital platforms, what they're also doing is generating lots of data, which can then be captured by capital and assetized and all the rest of it, and that gives birth to platform capitalism. So I was fascinated by that point you made about the original logic, at least from a social democratic perspective, about the knowledge economy was about empowering labor vis-a-vis capital with these new skills. But the fact that the knowledge economy also gives rise to this data economy clearly challenges that, and that's part of the reason why we haven't seen that. So it's more of an observation.
Yes, absolutely, and that's a big part of the story I'm trying to tell, is that shift in the digital model, where actually, it's not the case that workers can simply, if they don't like the terms of employment up, take their skills and move elsewhere, because actually a lot of the intellectual property is very valuable. A lot of the data on which they rely is monopolized by essentially 5 companies, maybe arguably 4 companies, plus in China things are different, but in sort of Western democracies we're talking about basically 5 companies, and if you don't work for one of those, you're going to struggle. The case of the guy, I forget his name, but the one who tried to move from Google's self-driving cars to Uber, and take intellectual property, and that sort of demonstrates, if you like, the breakdown in this model, whereby actually it's highly skilled labor that is the possessor of value and is king in this kind of scenario, and absolutely, so that's a big part and a really interesting part of how things are shifting. Knowledge economy in different national contexts. So the story in the book is primarily US UK focused, but it does touch on developments in Germany, say, where you saw Schroeder as part of this analysis, actually in quite close conversation with people like Blair, arguing for liberalization of labor markets. You're seeing the sort of Hartz-IV reforms, those kind of things coming in, and reflecting this knowledge economy analysis. So I think there was an attempt, at least in Germany, to move towards perhaps a more Anglo-liberal model that is implied by this kind of analysis. And then that move probably stopped in the wake of the global financial crisis, because the robustness of German economic performance seemed relatively preferable, sort of beyond that point. But it's an interesting story, and I'm quite tempted by writing another book on the, if you like, the varieties of knowledge capitalism that fall out of this, because in France you can see arguments about moving away from a sort of dirigiste model. Jospin came up with remarkably Blair-esque agenda in the late 90s around preparing France for the knowledge society. A lot of interest in software in France. Computer games programming and stuff was quite big there in the 1990s, still big in certain places in France today. So yeah, there's quite a lot of individual nuance between countries, and the Nordics as well, a different beast again. Places like Finland, companies like Nokia, etc. There's a lot of country level nuance, and yet, despite that, there's quite a lot of agreement. There are certain things that people disagree on. Probably the key things that you see disagreement between countries are on our level of social investment, which may be less a disagreement intellectually and more about what is politically possible in differently configured capitalisms. You also see disagreement about the extent to which welfare systems should be threadbare to sort of force everyone back into work in a kind of work fairist way, or whether actually, again, in the Nordics, you have something that's more supportive of a reallocation of labour from low productivity jobs to higher productivity jobs. So something that encourages job movement. So there are absolutely differences between countries, but there's also a hopefully moderately interesting story to be told about the similarities as well. So this is the similarities, and yeah, if I can bear to look at this stuff again, the stuff on the differences will come through at some point in the future.
Thanks so much, Nick. That's been a really enjoyable hour or so in your company. Encourage everyone to go out and buy the book. If you all need to stop Nick agonising about his Amazon sales figures, which he was getting quite anxious about in the pub last night. I thanks everyone who's contributed to the discussion too. It's been really fun. This has been this is the final of our sort of our political economy lunchtime seminars of the academic year, but hopefully there'll be another series announced soon. And as I say, we've got the annual workshop coming up too in September, which Nick is taking a lead on. But I'll let everyone get back to the rest of their day now and say thanks again to Nick and for everyone for participating.
Thank you, everyone. That was a really great discussion. Thank you.
That's it.